Welcome to Major Intonio's presentation of With the British Army in the Holy Land, by HEJAZ. Forward.
My aim in compiling this little book has been to provide a short account of the Palestine campaign, illustrated from the experiences of one who was present. The manuscript was written on active service, soon after the occurrence of the events recorded. It may, on this account, be sketchy, but it is hoped not the less interesting. My acknowledgements are due to the official dispatches and publications, and also to the writings of Mr. W.T. Massey, official correspondent with the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. HOL in the Field, 1918.
Chapter 1, Egypt and the Suez Canal.
The Holy Land has been the scene of war since the dawn of history. Long before Belgium became the cockpit of Europe, Palestine was the cockpit of the known world. Here, on the high road between Asia and Africa, were fought the great wars of Egyptians and Assyrians, Israelites and Canaanites, Greeks and Romans, Saracens and Crusaders. With these few square miles are associated the names of the world's greatest soldiers, no less than that of the Prince of Peace. None can fail to be interested in the latest campaign in this land of Armageddon. To understand the causes and events that led up to the campaign in Palestine of 1917 to 1918, we must first summarize, as shortly as possible, the modern history of Egypt. That country had for many centuries formed an integral part of the Turkish Empire, but she had been rapidly slipping from the grasp of the Turk. Early in the 19th century, Muhammad Ali had effectually thrown off the Turkish yoke. True, the Turkish suzerainty remained, but that authority was little more than nominal, and was represented by an annual money tribute paid to the Porte by the Khedive out of the revenues of Egypt. Both France and England had large financial interests in Egypt, especially after the construction of the Suez Canal, which was opened for traffic in 1869. The Suez Canal, in fact, became of vital importance to Great Britain. By a stroke of policy, the British government acquired the shares of the almost bankrupt Khedive, Ismail Pasha, and thus had a holding in the company worth several £1,000,000. But far more important to Britain was the position of the canal as the great artery of the British Empire, the most vulnerable point on the short sea route to India. Thus Britain became directly concerned in the affairs of Egypt, in its internal administration to secure peace within, and in its military defence to secure the country in general, and the Canal Zone in particular, from invasion by a foreign enemy. But the affairs of Egypt were in a most unsatisfactory condition. The army was wholly unreliable, and extravagance in high places had brought the exchequer to the verge of bankruptcy. In 1882, matters reached a crisis. A revolution broke out, headed by Arabi Pasha, and the situation looked desperate. Joint naval and military action by Britain and France was proposed, but the French ships sailed away and left Britain with a free hand. The British fleet bombarded the forts at Alexandria, and a military force, based on the Suez Canal, was landed at Ismailia. This force completely defeated the army of Arabi Pasha at Tel el-Kebir, put down the rebellion, and restored the government of the then Khedive, Tewfik Pasha. But the Khedivial government had been unable to cope with the rebellion single-handed. It had only been restored to power by British arms. It could not hope to retain that power unless continuously backed by the power of Britain. From this time forward, whether she liked it or not, Britain found herself effectually saddled with the direction of the government of Egypt. In this position, she became more fully confirmed by the Anglo-Egyptian military operations against the Sudan in 1885, under Gordon, and in 1898, under Kitchener. Outstanding differences with France were dispelled on the conclusion of the Anglo-French Entente Cordiale, and Britain was left virtually mistress of Egypt. Let us look for a minute at the military geography of Egypt, particularly with regard to the security of her frontiers from invasion. Egypt consists, or prior to the 70s consisted, of the Nile, its valley and delta, and the country rendered fertile by that river. On either side of this fertile belt is dry, barren desert. On the north is the Mediterranean Sea, and on the south the tropical Sudan. Thus, in the hands of a power that holds the command of the sea, Egypt is well adapted for defence. The tropical Sudan makes a well-nigh impossible line of advance for a large hostile force from the south, and the routes of approach from the east and from the west, across the waterless deserts, present obstacles scarcely less formidable. Since the 70s, however, another important factor has entered the problem, namely, the Suez Canal and the area of cultivation and civilization which has sprung up along its banks. The large amount of fresh water required for the maintenance of the canal, for the use of the towns that have sprung up along its banks, and for the existence of the large population which the canal has attracted, is brought by a canal known as the Sweetwater Canal from the River Nile. This Sweetwater Canal, and the piped services which it supplied, were in 1914 wholly upon the western or Egyptian side of the Suez Canal. This western side was also well provided with communications. Trunk railways connected Ismailia, at the centre of the canal, with Cairo and Alexandria, and lateral railways, running along the whole length of the canal, connected it with Port Said and Suez. Although, as was subsequently discovered, the problem of defending the Suez Canal was by no means the same as that of defending Egypt, the problems may, at first sight, appear identical. An enemy force moving from Palestine against the Suez Canal and Egypt would have to cross a comparatively waterless desert for a distance of over 100 miles. On coming into collision with the defenders of the canal, such an enemy would be operating far from his base, with a long and vulnerable line of communications, and with little or no available fresh water. The defenders, operating along the line of the Suez Canal, would be close to their base with admirable communications, both lateral and to the rear, and with the rich cultivated lands of Egypt on which to draw for supplies, whilst their supply of fresh water would be unlimited. The boundary line between Egypt and Palestine in 1914 ran from Rafah on the Mediterranean to the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, the northeastern arm of the Red Sea. This line runs right across the desert and is distant about 120 miles from the Suez Canal. At first sight, the boundary seems ideal, and insofar as the defence of Egypt alone was concerned, it left little or nothing to be desired. But, as subsequent events proved, this line was not good enough to safeguard the defences of the canal. On the outbreak of war, in August 1914, between Germany and Austria-Hungary on the one hand, and Great Britain, France, Russia, and Belgium on the other, the garrison of Egypt was augmented by troops sent out from England and India and from Australia. The Suez Canal, through which vast numbers of troops were passing, was of vital importance to the communications of the Allies, and was strongly guarded accordingly. 2 months later, November 5th, Turkey threw in her hand with the Central Powers. One of the baits held out by Germany to induce the Turks to enter the struggle was a promise that they should be restored to complete supremacy in Egypt. With the entering of Turkey into the war, and her open threats to invade Egypt, the protection of that country and of the canal became a matter of extreme urgency. The policy of defence adopted was that of making the line of the canal the line of resistance. A large portion of the low-lying desert to the northeast of the canal was flooded, so as to render approach by that direction impossible. Warships took up stations in the canal itself, while naval patrol launches took over the duty of guarding the Bitter Lakes. The troops detailed for the defence of the canal itself were entrenched upon the western side, with reserves concentrated at points of tactical importance. In this way, full advantage was taken of the lateral communications on the western side of the canal, while it was thought that the difficulties of crossing the desert on the eastern side would make approach by the Turks well nigh impossible. Meanwhile, the Turk was not letting the grass grow under his feet. Whether the Germans ever intended to pay the price for Turkish adhesion by sending a strong enough force to make the invasion of Egypt practicable is open to doubt. The Turkish rank and file was certainly led to believe that a serious invasion of Egypt was intended, but it is much more likely that the object of the Germans was to detain as large a British force as possible in Egypt, and thus prevent their taking part in the fighting in France. A secondary object may have been to render the Suez Canal temporarily impassable. Whatever may have been the chestnuts that Germany hoped to get out of the fire, it was clear that Turkey was willing to act as catspaw and attempt a foolhardy invasion of Egypt. Consequently, the construction of a new military railway in Syria was put in hand, and by January 1915, the Turks had formed advanced posts at Auja on the frontier, and also at Kosaima, El Arish, and Khan-e-Penis in the desert. The problem of water supply has always presented a difficulty to armies crossing this waterless desert. There are a certain number of reservoirs and cisterns which hold up water during the rains. In the wintertime, these would be full. The Turk is less particular about the water which he drinks than the white man, and doubtless he could, to some extent, be supplied from some of the brackish pools in the desert, with water that no one would think of offering to a British soldier. The light pontoons that the Turks dragged across the desert for crossing the canal are said to have been used for carrying water during certain stages of the advance. Suffice it to say that the Turks did succeed in solving the water problem, and in crossing the desert with a force of some considerable strength. On the 3rd February 1915, the threatened attack materialized. Before dawn, some of the light pontoons, which the Turks had brought with them, were launched on the canal. These were manned, while other Turks deployed along the eastern bank and opened fire to cover the crossing. The troops defending this portion of the canal, mostly Indians, opened fire upon the pontoons, with the result that many of them were sunk. 2 of the pontoons, however, reached the western bank, and their crews, numbering about 20, surrendered. There was fighting throughout the day, but no further crossing of the canal. On the next day, the east bank was swept, with the result that a considerable party of the enemy were captured. After this, the Turks withdrew and marched back to Palestine. This was the only time that a formed body of the enemy succeeded in reaching the canal. But they had shown that it was possible for them to achieve the almost impossible, and thus they gave the authorities responsible for the defense of Egypt much food for thought. The menace to Egypt was for a time delayed, though not wholly removed, by the expedition against the Dardanelles. To cooperate with our Russian allies, the British government decided, early in 1915, to attempt to force the passage of the Dardanelles. The strategic gains promised were highly attractive, and included the passage of arms and munitions from the Allies to Russia in exchange for wheat, the neutrality and possible adherence of the outstanding Balkan states, the severing of communications between European and Asiatic Turkey, the drawing off of Turkish troops from the theatres of the war, and the expulsion of the Turks from Constantinople, and ultimately from Europe. Incidentally, it was considered on the principle that the best defensive is an offensive, that a thrust at the very heart of Turkey, a threat against Constantinople itself, would afford the best means of defending Egypt. The story of the Dardanelles expedition has been often told and scarcely forms a part of this history, so a few words must suffice. In February 1915, we started by bombarding the forts with a few old warships. The forts at the outer entrance were soon silenced, and early in March, the warships moved up to the Narrows. On the 18th, a great effort was made to reduce the forts about the Narrows, but it failed, with the loss of 3 battleships and more than 2,000 men. This demonstrated the fact that the Dardanelles could never be opened by sea power alone, and accordingly, amphibious operations became necessary. An expeditionary force was assembled in Egypt, and Mudros was selected as the advanced base. On April 25th, landings were effected on the extreme point of the Gallipoli Peninsula. In spite of heroic attempts, we did little more than effect a precarious lodgment. Further operations were necessary. Additional divisions were brought out from home, and on the night of the 6th to 7th August, another landing was effected at Suvla Bay. But the new plan was no more successful than the old. Within a couple of days, this force also had settled down to a war of positions. Winter was approaching. Our positions on the peninsula would then become no longer tenable. No progress could be made, and at length it was decided to evacuate. The Suvla Bay force was withdrawn first, and the evacuation of the main body of troops was completed on the 20th December. The withdrawal was carried out with the same brilliance that had characterized the various landings, and with so small a number of casualties that it was described as an achievement without parallel in the annals of war. Many of the regiments that fought against the Turks at Gallipoli were withdrawn, directly or indirectly, to Egypt, and subsequently met the Turk again during the advance into Palestine. Included among these were the 10th, 52nd, 53rd, and 54th Divisions, besides regiments of Anzacs and Yeomanry. Insofar as the Dardanelles operations aimed at protecting Egypt, they were a success, for, while they were in progress, no organized invasion of Egypt was attempted. But the evacuation had the effect of liberating a large force of Turkey's best troops for operations against Mesopotamia and Egypt. It would be convenient to pause here and take stock of the military situation in Egypt, in the light of over a year's experience of actual war. In the first place, the Turks had disillusioned us as to the impossibility of crossing the waterless desert, and had actually crossed it with a considerable armed and organized force. They announced that what they had effected had been nothing more than a reconnaissance. In any case, they had shown us what they could do, and that, backed by the resources of the Central Powers, there would be no insuperable obstacle to their bringing a large and fully equipped army across the desert. In the second place, we had discovered that the problems of defending the Suez Canal and of defending Egypt were not identical. While the canal formed an admirable moat, an obstacle difficult to negotiate when stoutly defended, and so a capital defensive line for the protection of the Nile, yet this line was inadequate for the protection of the canal itself, or for securing the immunity of the passing shipping. And so thirdly, we realized that some other line must be found for the protection of the canal. While we were sitting on the west bank, small parties of Turks approached the eastern bank. On more than one occasion, in the summer of 1915, they succeeded in placing mines in the fairway of the canal. It would therefore have been quite possible for them to have seriously interfered with the working of the canal and the passage of shipping. Granted that a new line must be found, the question arises where such new line should be drawn. A line across the actual desert may be all very well in wartime, though none too easy to hold, for the reasons that we have already discussed. But to keep a garrison on such a line forever would be well nigh intolerable. Thus, by a process of elimination, we find that the most suitable line for the permanent defense of the Suez Canal is the fertile country beyond the eastern desert, in other words, Palestine. Fourthly, it had been brought home to us that the worst form of defense is a passive defense. As therefore the Turk would not leave well alone, but insisted on attacking us in Egypt, so it became necessary for us to meet him on his own ground, to push a vigorous offensive, and eventually to carry the war into Palestine.
This concludes today's reading of With the British Army in the Holy Land, by H.O. Locke. Join us also tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.